Okay, welcome everyone to our now 19th critical dialogue on reconciliation. This is also the first one in 2024, so happy New Year. I don't think we've seen each other since the beginning of the year. Also welcome to everyone for whom this is the first time joining a critical dialogue of reconciliation. I will just quickly introduce first myself and the space and the organization before I will hand over to Andrei. My name is Lucia. I'm a member of Rodeemos el Diálogo and hugely passionate about reconciliation and really excited about this space that we've been creating now for 2 years almost. So the critical dialogues on reconciliation are part of a series of dialogues that we've organized together with the Winchester Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, Embrace Dialogues, Rodeemos el Diálogo, and the Oxford Network for Peace Studies. For everyone, like I said, who's joining for the first time, just a quick introduction to RED. So RED is a transnational Colombian peace-building organization promoting peace through the culture of dialogue. We are involved in different aspects of peace building, kind of also geographically located into spaces. So in Colombia and in the UK, where we work more on international side, but the work we do in Colombia, for example, peace pedagogy and youth-led projects, so a lot of on-the-ground work as well. And then on a global level, we do events such as this one, dialogues and academic events. And we always try to learn from other places around the world as well to bring those learnings back to Colombia. So we're very excited to see such an international crowd. So thank you very much for joining. We try to always invite practitioners, a mix really, of practitioners, of academics, of decision makers when it comes to reconciliation and peace building, and to share their research and their experience and their activities. But very importantly, we are so excited to get people from various backgrounds, whether they're academics or not, whether they have any experience directly with peace building or not, because I think it's really you who make this space so special by sharing your experiences with us. So please feel really welcome to share your thoughts and any questions and to kind of take part in this dialogue actively when the time arrives. If you do like this event, please follow all of our work. I will share some links in the chat in a bit, and both on YouTube as well for everyone who's watching there. But I think that's pretty much it for the introduction. So once again, on behalf of Rodeemos el Diálogo, the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester, and the Oxford Network for Peace Studies, a very warm welcome. And now I'm handing over to Dr. Andrei Gomez Suarez. So Andrei is a senior research fellow at the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at Winchester. He's a member of the OxPeace steering committee, and to really cover all 3 organizations that are involved in this event, he's also the co-founder of Rodeemos el Diálogo, and he will convene today's dialogue and introduce today's guest, Dr. Angela Lederach. We're so thankful and excited that she's here today. And he will also start by introducing you to the culture of dialogue. Andrei?
Thanks, Lucia. That's great. And thank you, Angie, for accepting this invitation today. As Lucia said, I will introduce Angie properly in a few seconds. It's really good to see so many of you here. To see Rodi, with whom we started this series a few years back. So that's amazing. And some others who have attended so many other dialogues during the last few years. For Winchester and for Oxford and for Rodeemos el Diálogo, it's great to be here with you trying to make a difference. And in order to do that, we all believe in the importance of dialogue. And Rodeemos el Diálogo, for the last 12 years almost, has been talking about 6 principles for the culture of dialogue in order to try to work for social justice and compassion that are 2 of the key values of the University of Winchester too. And for us to have this dialogue today, we would like to remind those of you who have come in the past and those of you who are new to this space, these 6 principles, so that we can put them into practice over the next hour and a half and make this space truly transformative. The first principle that we talk about is generosity. So we invite you to be fully present in this space, to nurture your thinking, to listen to others. The second principle is solidarity. We invite you to unleash empathy and to try to see that what we are doing here is to alleviate the suffering of others who are resisting war in different parts of the world. The third principle is co-responsibility. We invite you to hold this space together, to make sure that this space is transformative. We all need to realize that we have a role to play. The fourth principle is honesty. We invite you to speak from your experience, to be humble. The fifth principle is respect. We invite you to see your own reactions, to hold your judgment, to suspend it, and to try to see what you can learn from other people's experiences. And the final principle, and for us really important, is the principle of self-criticism. So we invite you to don't confuse your assumptions with reality, to be critical and open-minded, and to nurture intellectual humility, so that probably you leave this space thinking something differently about previous ideas that you had. So these principles are gonna allow us to flow in this dialogue today, which we understand in a bit as a way of a transformative horizontal process, which gets closer to David Bohm's idea of a stream of meaning flowing among and through and between us. So the invitation in this space is to leave aside all patterns of interaction. This is not a seminar. This is not a lecture. This is a space of spontaneity for us to think together and see our individual patterns of thought and inconsistencies, perhaps. So the structure of this dialogue today is as follows. For the first 30 minutes, Angie and I will kick off the dialogue. We will try to put some ideas on the table for you to listen to them and to start flowing with us. Please do not drop questions or comments on the chat. Allow your own thought process to flow and see your own patterns of thinking while you are listening to us. Afterwards, what we are going to do is to open the floor for you in that moment to bring comments, questions, ideas, memories, dreams into the conversation, and we'll mix them together and we will see where that takes us. Because after listening to some of you, 3 or 4 people, depending on the length that you take, we will come back to Angie for Angie to share with us where your ideas and thoughts and dreams are taking her. And so we will weave this dialogue together and we don't know where we're going to end. But that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of doing a dialogue. So as Lucia said, please be aware that this dialogue is live stream. And what we are inviting you to do is that every single time that you are going to intervene in the second part of the dialogue, you turn your camera on, you open your microphone, and you voice what you are wanting to say. For that reason, we are not using the chat option, the chat option. At the end of the dialogue, in about an hour and 20 minutes, what I would do is try to wrap up in 2 minutes or so, leaving some food for thought for us to continue thinking about the things that were left on this space that we are sharing together today. So without further ado, allow me introduce our very special guest today to this 19th Critical Dialogue on Reconciliation. Angela Jill Lederach is Assistant Professor of Peace and Justice Studies at Chapman University. She has worked on peace building and restorative processes in Sierra Leone, Philippines, Ghana, Colombia, Bolivia, Guatemala, and the United States. You can see the broad scope of her practitioner experience. Her most recent research examines the creative and difficult work of grassroots movements in Colombia to engage to transform political and environmental violence to cultivate possibilities for dignified life in the wake of war. She is the author of Feel the Grass Grow, Ecologies of Slow Peace in Colombia, published by Stanford University Press in paperback in 2023, and co-author of When Blood and Bones Cry Out, Journeys Through the Soundscape of Healing and Reconciliation, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. Angela was a UC Jennings-Radford Peace Scholar between 2018 and 2019, and she holds a PhD in anthropology and peace studies from the University of Notre Dame. So as you can see, we have a great guest speaker today. So Angie, it's a great pleasure to have you here. And we are gonna kick off because your book is fantastic and it proposes an incredible idea that is in the title of this dialogue today. And I guess everyone is wondering, if they haven't read the book yet, what is this idea of a slow peace? What are we talking about here? So why don't we start with that?
That's a great place to start. And before I dive into it, I just want to thank you all for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. It's lovely to see so many faces that are familiar, many people who I've learned from, many people who contributed to my thinking as I was kind of working on this research, on the practice that undergirds and informs this research. And so it's just lovely to be with you all. For me this morning, so I'm joining from the morning here in California. And thank you, Andre, for the opening question around this concept of slow peace. So I am a cultural anthropologist and an ethnographer. And so I might answer this question inductively and begin by saying where the concept came from within the ethnographic process. And so the term in Spanish that I started to hear over and over was paz sin prisa, which actually translates more closely to peace without hurry or peace without haste. And this was in the course of multiple years of accompanying a grassroots coalition on the northern coast of Colombia, known as Montes de Maria, that has had a particularly difficult history with the violence. And often in settings where they were in meetings or negotiations with different state institutions or international organizations that were there to carry out certain kinds of peace programming. And one of the things that often emerged in the sides, in side conversations following those meetings or those negotiations was a critique that I started to hear circulating frequently, which is that our times are not the same, or that we have a clash in the times. Coming from grassroots social leaders who are working very much on the ground in rebuilding and repairing their community in the wake of war and in the face of ongoing forms of violence that had continued, including forms of structural violence. So this idea of the times really stood out to me because it was explicit. And I had thought in previous work a lot around some of the temporal dimensions of peace building, but I hadn't been in a space where people were so explicitly naming that at the root of the tensions that they were feeling with some of the way the implementation of the peace accords was happening, or the way that the implementation of collective reparations was unfolding, so that at the very heart of that was this clash in the times. And so I started to pay a lot of attention to that. And as I paid attention to that, what often came right next to that was, they're carrying this process, and often they're talking about the implementation of the accords or different institutional programs related to the accords. They're carrying it out with too much haste, with too much hurry. And we, as kind of grassroots members engaged in, had been for decades, so throughout the war, engaged in peace building, we're engaged in peace building sin prisa, paz sin prisa. We're engaged in building peace without haste, without hurry. And so I've, expanded that a little bit to conceptualize that as slow peace. And I do this for a number of reasons, one of which is I actually think there are a lot of qualities in what people were saying in making that claim that have resonance with other kinds of slow movements, including the slow food movement or the slow money movement. I'd be happy to kind of talk about that, where slowness is not just related to speed, or a quantitative measure. Slowness is actually a relational quality. And I think this became really important as I thought about this, because on the one hand, I fully understood in being in those kind of repeated negotiating tables with the state around reparation measures, where you're in meeting after meeting after meeting, and yet there's no kind of material implementation of what's being talked about, that the meeting itself became part of how the state was fulfilling its role. And that started to take a toll. Like, it gives that fast-paced sense of prisa, of haste. And at the same time, there was this real sense of complete delayed implementation, right? And so there was a real paradox in referring to this idea of prisa, this idea of hurry or haste, because what they're not saying that the state was fulfilling its obligations quickly. They're not saying that reparations are like, they're coming too fast and we don't have enough time to like organize. They're talking about a different kind of quality of relationship that was structured around the times. And so slowness for me became less about the measured dimensions of time and much more about the affective and relational dimensions of time. So I talk about this in the book in terms of a definition as a relational approach to peace building that includes a kind of multi-generational. So you're thinking across really deep time frames, and you're using generational thinking to animate daily actions of peace, both past and future kind of combined, so more cyclically oriented. Multi-species, there's a really deep tie to sense of place, sense of more than human relations that I think shape people's experience of time and the conflicts or the clashes they feel when they come up against sort of bureaucratic time or state time or intervention time. And that it's permanent, that it's ongoing. So peace here is not an end goal that one gets to and then it's over. It's understood as a social practice, as a way of life, and as a continuous part of a struggle for the conditions for dignified living. And so that reorients a little bit, or at least what it adds to, I think, something like the concept of, for those of you who are in the field of peace studies or coming from that field, the concept of positive peace, as espoused, often we talk about this as espoused by Johann Galtung, but also Dr. Martin Luther King talked about this frequently, including in the letter from Birmingham jail. So positive peace, where you're not just looking at the absence of war, but the presence of social justice. I think what slow peace adds to this is a temporal dimension, a temporal analysis that is really thinking about, on the one hand, it's looking at something like duration. What does it mean to engage in peace as a continuous practice or as a permanent process? How do we think about that across multiple generations and think generationally and act generationally in the work of building peace? But it's not just about duration. There is also this dimension of intention, of presence, of the ways that people relate to one another and the quality of relationships that they have with one another actually shape that experience of time. It's what, in the words of Deborah Tam, who's a kind of critical food studies scholar, it's what gives time its quality. And so I think that piece around intention and presence and attention is equally important in thinking about slowness in the concept of slow peace, and also when it's lacking, right? So it both emerges from a critique of the kinds of peace interventions that were coming at grassroots communities, that were being done with haste, and kind of counter-positioning claims to a different way of doing things. And that is what I, in this book, call slow peace. So I'll stop there, Andre, and hopefully that gives enough little pieces to.
And it's brilliant because, in a way, as you have explained, it complements the critique of liberal peace building that was done by McGuinty, in the past, and that example, scholars like Rodi have been working on recently too. And, sort of it comes and contributes to that. In a way, it makes me think a lot about the importance of the critique that we have done to the neoliberal project that focuses a lot on outcomes and, log frames. And that for the communities, it moves in a completely different dimension because, it's about processes. And I think what I find fascinating about what you have been also bringing into this beyond the scope of, like the just the temporal dimension, to put it in a way that, like the way how we feel the passing of time is the quality of it, and how you are broadening the debate to think about the more than human dimension of peace building, because it's the connection of, in slow peace, is the connection with the environment and the connection with the territory. And that's not only between human beings, that sometimes that, but and the rhythms and the cycles of the more than human are different. And some of the campesinos understand that really well and adapt to that, and do not try to manipulate nature in a way where they feel that they are above that. And I think the slow peace allows for that. So I wanted to ask you, or just to see, what you think about two things, or if you could expand a bit more on, first, the more than human, the dimension of slow peace. And the second one, you talk about the importance of presence in this. And I was wondering, because there is a long, you have shown us an important element of intergenerational work. So it's like history and future. Mm-hmm. But because it's a process, you are also calling our attention to focus on the present. Mm-hmm. To understand the dynamics that unfold in an spontaneous way, creating new opportunities for peace building. Is that the case? How important is the present in this slow peace concept?
So really rich questions. Thank you so much, Andre. Yeah, I mean, the time of forests are not the times of log frames. And that's actually felt viscerally. And I think it has outcomes that are damaging and that can be quite violent, not just to forest ecologies, but to people's lives and their livelihoods and their conditions of living. And so I'm, I have deep gratitude and very much indebted to my campesino colleagues who were the ones that extended enough trust for me to spend several years trying to understand what it is to be attentive to the multiple lives that shape and breathe life into the campo, or the countryside, into the rural areas. And they're very much part of the design of this project and the kind of the way it was carried out, and have been co-thinkers with me as I've tried to write this up. And the more than human piece, I think, is just fundamental to how people inhabit and are attentive to their place. So Angelina Gonzalez is a really significant social leader in Montes de Maria, in one of the areas that I work in, and she would often say, there is no life for the campesino if they're not in relationship with the campo. The campesino was born for the campo, and also that the campo was born for the campesino, right? So that it's a mutual relationship. And I think it took me a while to actually take very seriously the claim that was embedded in that phrase, that it wasn't just a flippant phrase of, this is a really significant place for us, but that it was an ontological claim and a way of being in the world that I needed to be much more attentive to. And where I work in kind of the high mountains, or the alta montaña of this territory, part of the story and experience of the war was also the degradation and the loss of a wider ecology, which was knit together through a kind of old growth avocado forest, which over the course of the armed conflict, over 90% of the avocado trees died. And so that had radical changes for the ecosystem, for the waterways, for, species, that also became endangered, or that fled because of the loss of some of that habitat. And so a lot of both the ways that people work to build peace, and the ways that they experienced and understood the violence was not just across human communities, it was also in relationship with their wider entorno, their wider ecology. And so it was really important to begin to understand that. And as I started to kind of center those questions in the research process, what became really clear to me was that how people inhabited or daily practices, the ways that shaped time, it was just radically different from the kinds of in and out helicopter mode of a lot of international peace programming. And this also came up then in the discourses of international peace workers, so not necessarily just state actors, but also state bureaucrats who are coming in and out. So if people showed up to a meeting late or a meeting got started late, that was considered wasted time. Or if people spent, it's a really important practice. And we can think about this in terms of reconciliation at the beginning of any kind of meeting, to greet every single person in the room with a handshake or to acknowledge their presence. And that was often talked about as empty or wasted time. That wasn't the substance of what the meeting was for. The meeting was about reconciliation, but these handshakes between people who had been estranged was somehow like not important, right? And so I started to really challenge and think about, and I was challenged myself to think about, well, what is the substance of relationships unfolding here? What shapes actually that quality of time? And I remember walking with two youth who were part of, so it's one of the intergenerational movements I work with. So they were coordinators of the Youth Peace Provokers movement in the Alta Montaña. And they were laughing about a recent trip to Bogota and how fast people walked. And it was, we were sort of bantering, so it was in this register of a joke, and then it became very serious. And Hokabet, one of the coordinators, said, for us, like, we move through the campo slowly so that we can see, how is the quality of the soil? Is there a fungus on the trees? How do we stop to greet and say hello to our neighbors? And so even this idea, these tropes of like, oh, people on the coast or in rural areas walk slow, or people in the cities walk fast, they're actually like practices and attentiveness to place and relationship that are just that are different, and they shape that quality of time in a different way. And so that slowness was really about cultivating and deepening those relationships. And when you're working in a place where communities had begun to see one another as enemy territory, where relationships were deeply eroded, where there had been a collapse of trust, that act of slowing down to greet a neighbor as you're moving through a place where 5 to 10 years ago you couldn't have passed is really significant. That act of shaking someone's hand before the meeting starts, shaking the hand of someone that you were terrified of, or that you saw as responsible for killing your brother or disappearing your brother, that is the substance of reconciliation. But it was dismissed as empty or wasted time, as not what we were there for. We were there to check certain boxes, to fill out attendance sheets, to fill certain quotas for the log frame. And so I think when people talk about that clash in times, it's really important to understand, well, what does that mean when they say that, and what's at stake when that clash happens. So I got a little bit sidetracked, so I'll just take it back to you.
I think, that this is the idea. I mean, we are not, but we're trying to think together, and that's the nature of it. But because I was going to say that you have started hinting to the relationship between slow peace and reconciliation, and how this notion can have an impact on how we think about reconciliation, or how reconciliation practices are carried out. But in the middle of that, or towards the end of it, you started dropping the importance of trust. And that triggered a memory of some of the work that we did in the past in Colombia, because precisely when Rodeemos el Diálogo partnered with the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace in 2017 and 2018 to do a project on narratives, on new narratives about, peace building in Colombia. What we discovered, working with more than 100 journalists and teachers and artists of the 32 departments of Colombia, is that the key emotion that they wanted to convey and work on was trust. That there was no trust with the state, and that there was no trust among communities, and that what had been totally destroyed by war was trust, and that you could not trust anyone. So that building, in a way, positive feelings about peace building in Colombia meant to regain trust and to invite people to trust others in a country in which the papaya law is the papaya law is the 11th commandment in Colombia. And for those of you who are not Colombians, when you land in Colombia, people tell you, we don't have 10 commandments like in the Catholic faith, but we have 11. And the 11th commandment is, you do not give papaya, meaning you do not trust other people, because if you give papaya, then people take advantage of you and eat your papaya. So so this issue of trust that you just mentioned here, and is how do you build trust? You cannot do it in a hurry. I mean, it's absolutely, you really need to slow down and have these small practices. And I think that one of the main concerns that we have seen in these critical dialogues on reconciliation in this series is that reconciliation in the last 25 years or so, and more, it's become a project of the international community, projectized. It's become also sort of dragged into the log frames of peace building, and now you can have reconciliation processes, just A plus B plus C equal reconciliation. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, let's go back to you and let's think a bit about, okay, reconciliation, slow peace. What are your thoughts about how this concept of a slow peace allows us to think about the core of reconciliation, and what are the new ideas that are coming together to think about reconciliation processes nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about that idea of both, and I think this is true. Anytime something gets put into a log frame, I think what happens is it becomes quantified. And so you're moving from something that is a process that's embedded in relationships, and those can be interpersonal, but it can also be structural relationships, to a project that, different A gets put in the A pot, and B gets put in the B pot, and C gets put in the C pot, and then you have this time frame that is, locking it in, right? And then you have to prove that you've met all of those metrics, rather than thinking about the integration between them, thinking about what gets lost in the interstices, and what that kind of practice actually does to the quality of relationships people can then have. And so thinking about something like reconciliation as like, if I have A plus B, I'll get C, and that's the outcome. That's just not how I have experienced the most profound moments of the actual practice of reconciliation. And so in Colombia, I work with a movement who chose as the title, as the name of their movement, they chose to name themselves the Proceso Pacífico de Reconciliación e Integración. And so they have the peaceful process of reconciliation and integration of the Alta Montaña. And they spent a lot of time trying to figure out what word to give, what name to give to themselves. And it became very important as a collective to name themselves, to include in that name reconciliation. And this is 52 very rural communities, some that had military accompaniment after displacement and had close ties to the military, where the paramilitary kind of bases were more present. Some that were forcibly displaced at different moments during the war and returned on their own, and then were often victimized or survived forms of very severe state violence or paramilitary violence, but where different guerrilla organizations set up bases at different moments of the war. And so you had what people called invisible barriers. And it's a campesino movement that grew out of the need to address the death of the avocado in the region. They're, not only their primary livelihood, but also a kind of key component of an ecosystem that allowed the campo to thrive. And so they started to cross these invisible lines out of that need. And it was only over time that they started to see the work that they were doing to organize as campesinos, with this love and in defense of the campo, as also the work of reconciliation. And I remember talking to a very wise, a very powerful social leader who's very quiet. He doesn't speak often, but when he speaks, everybody listens, whose name is William Hardava. I remember him saying, when we first started using the words reconciliation, I thought that we had achieved it, that we were naming ourselves that because we were a movement that had been reconciled. But I've come to understand that reconciliation is always ongoing. Because those histories of war that, experience that really profound erosion of trust, whenever there are moments of, new instantiations of violence, or when forms of structural inequality become exacerbated, or when state interventions do things in a way that actually divides communities instead of helps to support some of their integration. So, a state intervention that came in that was going to work in the Alta Montaña, but only worked in one single community, is a very divisive and profoundly toxic program. And this happened all the time. So reconciliation became an ongoing process, and it became really important that they name themselves that, and that they repeated that name to remind themselves of what the work was that they were doing. And so for me, I think that's much more important, and that's a lot harder to measure in a 3-year project. And I think that's the tension, and that's the challenge, and that's what I think that's what we need to move beyond as a field. So when I'm saying we, I'm including myself in this field of kind of international peace building. What would it mean to actually support processes as they're identifying their needs and their priorities and their forms of relating to one another, rather than having them sort of bending this way and that to like meet whatever budget priorities have been set out, or to show that they've checked the box for whatever they put in the log frame from the previous year. And I think for me, part of what I continue to kind of really find profound hope in the work of movement building, because movement building is also an ongoing process. And I think there's been a lot of emphasis on sort of more formalized organizations, but I also think there needs to be a lot more attention to what does it mean to actually support a process of movement building or of coalition building. So that's, you know, in that shift from project to processes, I think really thinking about what it means to support community organizing in its various iterations around the world is really important.
Angie, I think I would like to ask you a sort of put a final thought on the table before we open the floor for those of the participants who would like to start asking questions or making comments, so that we broaden this dialogue and we create a stream of meaning here. So for you guys who are already having some thoughts and some ideas, and you would like, and you know, have to leave early, and you would like to leave something before on the table before you leave the space, please start putting your hands up. But let me ask you this sort of, I mean, bring a comment or a question here to try to think together, particularly because I see some of our students at Winchester, and we have been talking a lot about reconciliation. And I guess you're familiar with the work of John Paul Lederach and the meeting place. And the meeting place, the whole idea of, you know, the place where truth, justice, mercy, and peace meet. And that meeting place is the place of reconciliation, because it's a journey and a place at the same time. But in the case of this process of this community, or the way how you were describing it in this regional space, there was, I mean, probably just because you didn't get deep into it, we didn't hear necessarily any truth dimension to it, or justice, you know, sort of. And so just to be quite provocative also, and you know, is there a need for always a minimum dimension of truth or justice for this reconciliation processes to unfold? Or it is deeply problematic, and we should move away from the idea that we could claim that universally truth and justice, as we you know, are necessary for processes of reconciliation?
Yeah, what a question. For those of you who don't know or who are wondering, and maybe you can now infer, but John Paul is my dad, and also my co-author in a book that has the title Reconciliation in it. So I was trying to like remind myself what we were thinking at the time of writing that book before this meeting. I was thinking about, you know, I now teach that meeting place, and I've done it in trainings, but more recently in teaching, what I've asked students to do when they embody each of those terms is I've gotten a little bit more specific about what they're looking at. You know, so what does truth ask for? What does truth feel? What does truth fear? What does truth demand? And doing that with each of those terms, I think, pulls out, it's a meeting place, and maybe we think of a meeting place as like this happy space of like resolution, but actually it's highly contested. It's tense, and it's hard. It's really hard. And I think when you start to kind of tease out the fears or the desires or the aims, you find both where some of those alliances might be, but also why it's so profoundly difficult. Because what mercy fears, you know, is often what truth demands. And so really trying to sit in that tension, I actually think is the work of reconciliation. And I think there is a tendency, at least in popular discourse, or to sort of flippantly think about this term of reconciliation, that it's resolution or it's all happy, good feelings. But I actually think it's like living in that space of tension or dissonance, and moving across to kind of embrace that, to learn from that, to grow from that, to see what, you know, what was deemed impossible becoming possible through that. But it's uncomfortable, like profoundly, and it's hard. I think, again, kind of going back to the Alta Montaña, to the peaceful process, this movement that I've been working with for the last decade now, they when they started their historical memory process, which was one of their reparations demands, after a nonviolent march that they led, they had a set of 91 agreements they signed with the state. And one of those was to carry out what they called a living memory process. And it was different in some ways from some of the other historical memory processes in Colombia, because they required as a stipulation that it was members of the community who lead it, who be trained to do the interviews, and who helped to write it. And they did that with the support of the National Center for Historical Memory. But it was guided by and for the community. But the community, you know, as I've said, of the Alta Montaña is a highly heterogeneous, you know, deeply divided, had very different experiences of the war, of displacement, of return. So there's no single narrative, nor is there a single truth. And they were quite explicit about naming that up front, that there are multiple truths and that there were multiple experiences of this war, and we want this text to capture those. So I think when we talk about something like truth in the process of reconciliation, if we're thinking about the multiplicity of truths, or truths as lived, or truths as people being able to really share deeply some of their experiences and hear experiences of others, then yes, I think there's a space for it. But if what we're searching for is kind of like a detective, here's this singular truth that we're after, and we all have to agree on it to move from this point to this point, then I think we've lost something perhaps in the process. But I think, again, shifting reconciliation away from a formula or an end point, and thinking about it much more as a kind of ongoing practice, as an ongoing process. You know, the meeting place, I think, helps to think about components, perhaps, but is perhaps limited, you know, if it's interpreted as like, we need all of these things, and then we'll have this goal that we're working for reconciliation, then I think it can be damaging. Because there are individual journeys, there are structural components to that. You know, there are dimensions of inequality and invisibility. You know, so victims of state violence, you know, are in a different place to petition for a recognition than victims of other kinds of violence, right? So there is this sort of recognition, inequalities in the forms of recognition, public recognition. And so I think that's where that, you know, Roxani Cristalli often has this phrase of, you know, how do we, you know, hold multiple truths in one embrace? And in that sense, I think that's a key part of the work of reconciliation. But when we kind of put these ideas into boxes and then put that into a formula, I think that can actually undermine the possibilities for social healing.
Brilliant, Angie. I think, you know, with that, I think we have put lots of food for thought on the table. I can see already 3 hands that are willing to come and jump in creating this stream of meaning together. Just before I start giving the chance to every one of you to voice what you want to share with us, let me just drop a question for everyone in the room, because I think it would be interesting to see. I know that many of you are not experts on Colombia, and it'd be interesting to see if you find this concept of a slow peace as something that is useful for you to think about the context in which you have been working on, and whether you would like to share, you know, how you find that concept useful beyond Colombia, because of course this is a global dialogue for us to think about this. We have already lots of hands, So we are gonna start listening to you. I think we're gonna stop monopolizing this dialogue for a while. Angie and I are gonna turn to the background, and we are gonna start with Eduardo. So Eduardo, over to you.
Amazing, thank you. Can you guys hear me and see me there? Right.
Yes.
Hey everyone. Hi Angie. It's always nice to see you once again. Thank you for your talk. This is a really, really interesting concept, this slow piece. And I had, well, two questions. You can choose to answer either or both of them. The first would be, do you think this concept of slow piece, this other way of experiencing time, and I'll say the imaginaries that entails, does it have some link with religious imaginaries or religious thought? Especially in the context of peace building efforts. I mean, I'm thinking it does seem to resonate strongly with religious idea of inner peace, with gaining awareness of surroundings, of others' dignity, of spirituality and transcendence. So that might be question number one. And then the second one, I was curious about your book. I haven't read it, but I thought, I mean, do you limit yourself to a description of these different imaginaries or these different approaches? Yes, thank you. And they, my question would be, are you just describing, or are you also suggesting ways in which this new imaginary on time, this slow piece, might bring certain benefits, or even have you explored ways in which people who don't share or don't experience it might start to do so?
Thank you, Eduardo. I think you really enjoy reading the book, and the tensions with the multinational companies and the NGOs and the foundations.
I can imagine.
I can imagine. The state, but I will leave this for Angie to pick it up later on and see how it goes.
Amazing. Thank you.
Paula, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon and morning for those who are in other time zones. So my questions, I actually had an initial question, but you ended up answering it, related to the outcomes and this pressure from funding, because maybe we know, or well, that's what I think. It's quality. It's one of the most important things during peace processes, right? But then, because you need to meet some deadlines, and of course there is the funding, and in research, for example, you have to meet those deadlines. So there is like this middle ground that you have to somehow create. And I was wondering, like, how can that be done? Like this relationship between this world outside that is demanding the outcomes, the not the process, but like those statistics maybe, or numbers, and maybe with the qualitative process, right? You cannot always meet those quantitative numbers, right? So that's one of the questions that I have for it. And then my other question is related to education. And I was thinking, like, how from the educational perspective, how the educational field can contribute to this slow peace process, specifically in cases such as Montes de Maria. So like post-conflict scenarios, and yeah, like that's something that I was wondering too. And that's it.
Thanks, Paula. I can see that, you know, your concept, Angie, has created lots of questions for people. But again, not everyone has to ask questions. Just a reminder to people on the room that you can just participate and share comments and ideas. But thank you so much, Paula. And let's go to Yom.
My thoughts were probably quite radical, is to drop the word reconciliation and instead have as a goal to say, what can I do for my enemy to help your children and your grandchildren grow in peace? And what can you, my enemy, do to help my children and my grandchildren grow in peace? And how can my children integrate with your children? And when we have that as a goal to aim for, then reconciliation is there in the background, but it's not the kind of main aim. I've been part of a voluntary thing for 16 years as street plasters, which you have in Winchester. And it was started by a friend of a church minister was shot and killed in Jamaica. And so after the funeral, a few people prayed together, and they went out and they said, what can we do for these gangs of children going around with guns and poverty and drugs and things? What can we do to help you? And I think the voluntary sector of how we approach reconciliation or peace building, because when we shift the goal to our children and our grandchildren's generation, that slows the peace down incredibly. And it's not for my generation to have that peace. It's for my generation in a way to give up my thoughts of justice.
Thanks, Yom. That's brilliant. I think we have 4 more questions or comments that we are gonna have in the second round. Let me just read this comment from Nancy Carvajal, who dropped it on the box to add it to the conversation, and then let's go back to Angie to see where Angie's thoughts are at the moment, and then we come back to Frances and the rest of the people who are waiting to voice their comments. Nancy saying, greetings from Colombia. I have had the opportunity to work with allies of the Truth Commission, such as the Foundation for Reconciliation, and supported the Commission's work. I thank you for this approach of slow peace as envisioning peace building and reconciliation as a process work with communities from grassroots. And she is recommending a website of Reconectando in order to see the work that the Truth Commission has done. So the usefulness of the concept for Nancy is being put on the table. So Angie, shall we come back to you and see what your thoughts are, whether you want to, answer some of the questions, or whether some of the questions created some thought processes on you that you want to share with us, and then we come back to the rest of the people?
I muted myself. Well, it's, again, so great to see and hear people who I haven't seen in person in a while. Eduardo, thank you for your question. I think in some ways you were starting, and I would love if there's time for you to share more around, well, if I haven't talked, for example, as much about the religious imaginaries in this book, what would you add to that? How would you extend that? Because I think you've done a lot of thinking around this. But I think certainly there is, in the text, I talk about this as an ethics of attention, a kind of, there is a moral disposition that is attuned to life amidst violence, right? And it's about the cultivation of those dispositions that I think some of the practices of slow peace emerge. As an ethnographer, I think it's descriptive, but I also hope what I'm doing is showing here how a number of communities and social movements are doing this. What are some of those practices? So I think about something like the practice of living memory as kind of a key component. So Memoria Viva. Think about the practice of the youth engaged in river mapping, and basically they were tracing a stream from the top of the Alta Montaña out to the sea. And as they were mapping, what they were doing was meeting with community members in all of the communities they passed to talk about the stories that were tied to those places. So that included different myths and legends, but it also included some of the stories of the founding of those communities. It included stories really tied to place. And then they were also tracking things like erosion and species. And so it cultivated this really very acutely attuned focus. And so when I talk about the ethics of attention, I'm trying to look at what are some of those practices that shape dispositions, moral dispositions to the multiple lives around us. And there's a real, back to Andre's question from a while ago, on the one hand, it's very much about imbuing the present moment with a kind of richness and focus and attention. But it's doing that in a way that's drawing on, or that includes, the sense of an ancestral past and understanding the trajectories of that past. And it's a way, particularly for the youth that I work with, many of whom were born in the midst of war, and who talked a lot about how there were large moments of their life where they didn't really have a sense of projection. So imagining the future for themselves was very difficult until they started to engage in community organizing work and movement building. And that's really where, kind of imagining new futures for themselves came into play. And I think that's really tied to these practices that are very much about the present and being present, in the place where you're at, understanding your history that lives in that place, reclaiming that as part of your own self, notion of self and identity. And so for me, those are very much spiritual imaginaries that are tied to forms of moral dispositions or a kind of ethics. But I would, of course, be very interested in how you as you're listening or in your own work, how you might think about the temporal dimensions of that work. In terms of this question around funding, and I will say, I think this gets to the this idea: do we drop the term reconciliation? What are we we're talking about imagining future, the kind of conditions of well-being for future generations. And I think I've often struggled with the term reconciliation. I use it lightly, and I use it especially as an ethnographer when it's meaningful to people, to try to understand when and why and how it's meaningful to them, to deepen my own sense of that. And in the kind of previous book that I co-authored with my dad, John Paul, we kind of shift away from talking about reconciliation and instead focus on what we called in that book social healing. To try to think about those questions of well-being, the way that it's a deeply social process. What are the conditions necessary for well-being to take place in terms of social life, and how are communities creating or advocating for those conditions. I think that funding streams are very damaging, and I think it's really easy to critique state bureaucrats who are, and I think if you haven't read Gwen's book, it's an incredible text thinking about how challenging it is to be the face of peace and to be the ones that are, if you've inhabited those roles where you're trying to meet funding deadlines, where you're trying to meet the log frames that's been set out by an organization, if it's a state bureaucracy and there are different political or electoral moments, oftentimes people are only contracted for 6 months, so they're living in tremendous precarity, or they're doing 5 different contract jobs at the same time. I mean, the actual people who come to facilitate a negotiation or to present a kind of state program are under enormous amounts of their own kinds of constraints. And so it's really important to think about what are the structural and institutional dimensions that then cause these meetings that are done with haste or with hurry. And I think funding is one of those key pieces. And I think one of the questions is, what's the middle ground? So how do you do this work of kind of relationship building or like ongoing open-ended forms of deepening and cultivating forms of justice and social repair, and still meet funding requirements? And I think actually refusal is something that I'm quite interested in. So the coalition that I work with in Montes de Maria, of which the peaceful process, the campesino movement, is part of, for a very long time refused external funding on the grounds of the harm that it did to their coalition. And it was So they tried to distribute resources. Everybody contributed what they could in different ways. So because they have, they include members who are considered allies as well as grassroots or base members from campesino communities. Sometimes what people were contributing was food for lunch from, that they had cultivated. Sometimes what people contributed was finances. But it's only recently that they've started accepting external funds, and that's only on the grounds of really clear stipulations about what their territorial priorities are and the ways that those territorial priorities are set by them as a coalition in January of every year. And I actually think maybe that's, so that doesn't sound like a middle ground, but I think that's like I think that's very hard to do when you're working in a context where there are a lot of financial constraints, but really significant in trying to shift the dynamics of what does that funding determine, what strings are attached to that funding, and then what does that do to a wider process. And I should say that this coalition emerged out of a previous effort that really collapsed, and it collapsed and was very toxic in part because of the way that funding was distributed by the EU. And so they're, taking that lesson and shifting how they're organizing themselves. So I'll leave it there for the second round, Andre.
Brilliant, brilliant, Angie. And actually, you made me think also of the middle ground that Rodeemos el Diálogo has found, and is to rely on the voluntary work of members like Paula, who recently have joined Rodeemos el Diálogo, so that you don't rely only on the funding in order to do the peace building work that you need to do, but actually to have some degree of freedom and motivation and enthusiasm. So most of the work that we do is on voluntary basis, and actually then you have your own agenda, and then, but in a way it takes a long time to balance the whole thing. But you are absolutely right to mention these things. So let's go back to the floor now. So Frances, over to you.
Hello, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. So my question was also related to funding, but I wondered if there was an opportunity to do sort of this meeting place, embodiment, slow peace building with the donors themselves and state actors and those sort of focusing on log frames, if there's something within that, so almost to build bridges between the two. And if there will be some people just focused on the log frames within those institutions, but then I'm sure there are also people working on that slow peace building and how we can kind of work with them. And as you say, it may not be a fast process. It may be like multi-generations of changing these big institutions. But if there's something there, and yeah, also relate to what you say about many years ago, I was in Rwanda on a prisons program, and we were very much into like, right, we're delivering this training and we've got to do X, Y, Z. But the people we were working with were very much into, well, no, let's have a conversation and it's okay if the program changes. And we really had to like go with that. And, when things happen, the electricity breaks down. And it was a really formative experience for me in my 20s, and really respecting those who we were working with on the training, that it's not about delivering the sort of perfect program. So yeah, thank you.
And that comment coming from you, Frances, who you are a practitioner yourself, is so useful, because as Angie was saying, this is not to demonize, but it's so interesting, this question that you're asking, of how do we create the meeting place with the donors. So let's see where this is going to take us. Joan, it's so lovely to see you again. So now is also your turn. So over to you, Joan.
Well, thank you so much for letting me know about this. And thank you, Angie. I've read the book, as Angie knows. But I think that ideas came up just listening to you speak. It might be a bit of a detour, but I'm not sure it entirely is. When you speak about slow peace, I started to think about what is your notion of slow research, which is not just participatory. It's way more. It's way deeper. It's much more involved. That's my question.
That's brilliant, Joanne, and I really want to hear Angie's response. I wonder if it could be connected also to slow writing and slow production of academic texts that are now what in the UK are used for the ref and to measure your productivity as an academic. So this is a very interesting and important question that might open a new detour here. Great. Juliana, over to you in Edinburgh.
Yes, yes, and I love the last question because I'm just starting my PhD in Edinburgh, so it's a very relevant, provocative question. And so first of all, it's very nice to see a lot of familiar faces here, and to have Andre in Edinburgh. I haven't read your book yet, Angie, but I'm totally going to now. I was going to say that I don't come from an academic background. I come more from the practitioner background, and I've been working in Colombia, both in the High Commissioner for Peace and then with Dare to Dialogue, which shares a lot of characteristics with Rodeemos el Diálogo, working in social dialogue with national leaders in Colombia that would usually don't get together. And most of the work that I did in Dare to Dialogue resonates so much with the idea of a slow peace that you're talking about today, and how this importance of relation quality can totally challenge the idea of time, and can totally challenge how do we do this work when it is regarding like all the things that donors, funders, and everyone asks us that, like, how do you know you're achieving something? And it's so important questions that actually got me to where I am now. So back on the university, and my question, Angie, has to do with, in my experience, I have this feeling that there's so much work so much attention being paid on the arguments, on the rationality of relationships, and we need, that is important, but we need a lot more of the humanness, that it's not very much, that doesn't have that much to do with the argument and the rationality. So I am working and interested in researching now about the role of creativity, and I would like any ideas of the role of creativity for this. And also very important, and I love the fact that you're talking about it, how can the more than human also help us bridge among differences, make us more humble, make us more curious. Maybe when you were talking about the more than human today, you were talking a little bit about how, for example, campesinos understand that, and we can like, this could turn us apart, but I'm thinking of how the more than human can also turn us back, closer. So yeah, I'll stop there not to take more time. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Juliana, and really great to have you and to be near in Edinburgh and all the work that you've done in dialogue. And yeah, now we are not anymore in Oxford. We are in Edinburgh, thanks to Gwen, who is actually the person who wants to ask the next question and make the next comment. So Gwen, over to you here behind me, but I have blurred the space. Oh dear, go back.
I think this is easier for me to ask it here, because otherwise my sound is going to get really echoey. Hello, everyone. We're in my office because we don't have Wi-Fi at home yet. So we're kind of in a strange moment. Anyway, Angie, thank you so much for being here. It's fantastic to hear you talk about your book, and I'm so excited. It's so interesting to explore the resonances between our work, and I think it would be so cool to, I'm waiting for the day when we can do a class together on top-down and bottom-up approaches to peace with our two books. But I have a question about about speed, because there's been a lot of focus in this dialogue so far, I think, on the speed imposed by log frames and funding structures and projectification of peace, which is all really important. But I think there's another dimension that we haven't spent so much time talking about, and that's the time of politics. And you have kind of mentioned it in passing, but I think it would be worth for us to spend a bit more time, because I think that, you know, when we talked about the project, for example, that André mentioned with the OxPeace and Rodeemos el Diálogo, we had the frustrations were not just to do with the funding structures, but the time limit imposed by election cycles, because we were trying to have an impact on narratives that were going to have an impact on who got elected, because it matters which government is in charge. And we, as civil society organizations and the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace and many other grassroots organizations that were involved, really agreed on the need, the urgency. And I think you make a really nice distinction in your book between the tension between, you know, slowness does not negate urgency. There is definitely like an interesting tension there. But I think that, you know, how do we deal with the need for speed in politics when we're trying to think about elections that favor peace at the same time? Because campesinos and small grassroots organizations want, you know, pro-peace governments to win elections, even though they're not perfect and they may not like them all that much. But, you know, I'm not sure I'm phrasing this question well, but I think you get where I'm going, and I would just love to hear your thoughts on the tensions between slow peace and political timeframes. And I'm going to go and sit back down over there because I'm watching you from over there, but my sound is off, so I'm hearing you from over here.
So to get back to you, Angie, I'm just going to make a controversial comment here, because probably what we need to stop thinking is on, you know, this cycle of elections that change government every 5 years and have regimes that last for 40 years. You know, I mean, I know that there are lots of criticisms to dictatorships, but the one way of working around this is to change the times of politics. What about if we have, you know,
a peace-building dictator?
I don't know. But anyway, this is the food for thought for our thinking together here. So over to you, Angie, to share some thoughts where your ideas are at the moment, and probably we do a final wrap up.
Yeah, thank you for all of these really rich questions. I, you know, thinking, Gwen, about this question of kind of electoral time, which, you know, there is an urgency. Also, it's not just that politicians are trying to, you know, get certain programs, the box checked so that they can, use that as part of their campaigning, but there is also, you know, what are ways to shift or increase voter turnout, and those were really important questions over the course of my research around the plebiscite, and then around the following election that ended in Duque's election. And so I was not immune to the sensation of that. But I'll return to Ricardo Esquivia, who is the director of Sembrando Paz and who's you know, a longtime human rights organizer, Afro-Colombian, who really helped to envision and facilitate the initial foundation for the coalition, the regional space of Montes de María, the Espacio Regional. And one of the things that Ricardo often talks about is what we need to be able to build is an organized civil society that, you know, has as that foundation the ability to have work against those currents of moments, you know, so whether that's an election cycle or whether that's a funding cycle, that organized civil society be permanent and continuous. And it's been a little over 10 years. I was at the very first meeting, or maybe it was the second, of the Espacio Regional, of this coalition. Its history is much deeper, much deeper, but in its current iteration. And what they have done is to commit to sustained dialogue process as, you know, members and representatives of either the 200 social organizations committed to peace in Montes Maria, along with a number of allies from universities, state institutions, and NGOs. And they have met every first Saturday of the month since they began without fail, even through the pandemic. So they moved to cell phones, and it was often a little bit hard, but there was still this deep commitment. And every year they identify territorial priorities. And I think that that actually is what is needed to be able to sort of weather electoral, kind of these waves of electoral cycles, because what you have then is a sustained platform, a foundation of a group of people committed to one another with a shared set of goals that are, so they're not in sort of crisis response mode, but understand that this election cycle is coming. What are the ways that we might advocate for this? And it doesn't get away from like the way, the end of the year, December always like speeds up, right? Because everybody's trying to like complete things. So even if they're engaged in this kind of slower process, or what I'm calling slow peace, they're not in any way immune to these cycles. And that's the same for electoral cycles. But I think what that kind of a platform does is it builds power from the ground up, and it creates a sustained space that is organized, that is coalitional, that is centered around territorial priorities, that is, I think, really important for being able to then respond to crises in a way that's not crisis driven and not necessarily reactive, but grounded in a kind of wider structure that they've built over time. And I would say that they, over the last 10 years, the strength of that coalition to me has been really remarkable, in the ways that they are now the ones that convene state actors, in their ability to refuse meetings unless it's on the grounds that they're setting, in their ability to articulate some of those territorial priorities. It has not always translated into, the elections in the ways that they would like to see them. So in terms of having an impact on elections, I think they're still working on some of the dimensions of that political organizing. But I think that's the long work that they're committed to, and I take great hope in what they're doing. So it's kind of half answer to your question, Gwen, but there is an urgency, and that comes at different moments. And it's part of the reason I want to say that slowness actually doesn't negate that sense of urgency. If a drought hits, there is a sense of urgency in people's demands for material reparations, right? When you're living in the midst of, increasing security risks, there's a sense of urgency there. But I think it is in the face of that urgency that people were repeatedly calling, officials or allies to slow down. Because I think often responses to urgency result in greater and deeper forms of harm. I'm cognizant that we're getting close to the end of time. I would say, Joanne, thank you for this lovely question to think about slow research and maybe what it means in terms of its relationship with participatory research. For me, it was always, am I being consistent or coherent, coherente with what I'm writing and how I'm doing it? Or with what people are claiming and demanding and how I'm responding to that as a researcher. And so there are so many times where the things that they were saying to state actors, they could have been saying to me. And so really trying to take those to heart in my own process. And so at its basic level, how always do I put the collective and political process of the movements that I am aligned with and committed to advocating and amplifying first. And that produces a tremendous amount of dissonance as an academic. And so really trying to think through that question, I think, will be really generative for me. So I appreciate that. I might just end before I turn it over, because I haven't talked about where the title comes from, which is also from Ricardo Esquivia, the director of Sembrando Paz. And he, it was in kind of an afternoon conversation with him at the very end of it, where he said the work of the grassroots is to be, is to see, feel, and is to see and feel the grass growing, right? It's to be so close to the ground that you can feel the grass grow. And I think that gets at that idea of slow research. How am I so close to the ground that I'm kind of feeling the grass grow? And I think that is about that kind of idea of being very present to that moment, but understanding that that moment is imbued with an ancestral past of struggle, with future possibilities that are open and that we're striving for and that we're trying to support. But it's in like nurturing the seeds that allow that grass to grow, that is like the work of the grassroots. And so I kind of have taken that as, and I'm not always good at doing it, but how do I allow that to also guide the approach to research, or my commitment and my relationship in the communities that I've had really the honor to be with.
Angie, I thank you so much for that. It's a shame that Eduardo is not here, because the comment that I'm going to make based on the last thing that you said is that if there is a religious imaginary behind this, it's a Taoist one. It sounds so Taoist, what you just said. I mean, feeling the grass and, like really proper, beautiful Taoism, and I guess, but I'm aware of the time. I'm aware that we said that we're gonna be here for an hour and a half only. But in the spirit of generosity of Rodeemos el Diálogo, I'm gonna allow Lucia Bihar to actually make a comment or answer or make a question, because it's her birthday today, and her birthday present was to have you on this space. And I think it would be very unfair as a co-convener of this space not to give her the chance to have her birthday present. So Lucia, over to you.
And I do think Nancy was before me still, so I hope she can forgive me. But actually, I think listening to you, Angela, but also other people talking about the desire for slowness in different processes, right? So including research, but I think also in everyday life, and how rarely we have the opportunity to really slow down, to engage with whatever is happening around us. I think I tend to link that always to psychology, because that's where my background is, and so like automatically my bias goes towards that. But it feels we were not necessarily built to be reacting so quickly to the world around us the way we have to now, and the way we're sort of forced by the natural processes that are happening, or like the way the world is moving. And I know that, like, in terms of dialogue spaces, which kind of ask you also to slow down, to participate in them, to kind of really be able to listen to yourself and to the others. I feel like the reason they're so engaging and often kind of evoke such positive emotions is because it's a rare state to be in. And the more I find you engage in them, the easier it is to apply some of that slowness into everyday life. So I think I really like the idea of kind of applying that more broadly, almost like creating a huge container all around us, or like a huge dialogical space in every single process that we're in, which obviously would be my ideal world. But yeah, that was my thought. That kind of, that's what came to mind listening to everyone sort of appreciating a more considerate approach to really everything we do. And also, thank you so much for coming to today's Critical Dialogue on Reconciliation.
Oh, thank you for doing this on your birthday, and for that kind of lovely thought to continue to sit with too. Happy birthday.
So Angie, and I think, usually, as I said at the beginning of this dialogue, I usually do a 2-minute wrap up to try to offer some food for thought. But I think that Lucia has done a really beautiful way of ending, thinking about the importance of a slow dialogue, and how, this space have been so calming today. It's been a thoughtful space. I can see how for so many people, the curiosity a curiosity has been opened to think about, the way they've been engaging with their own practical work, how they've been thinking about peace building, how they engage with the way how they do research. And I think it shows the quality of this dialogue, this quality that is at the core of the slow peace that you're precisely sort of researching, promoting, talking about. You have also invited us to challenge some of the time conceptions that we appropriate uncritically from the way how, this neoliberal economic system works, and that sort of in a way traps us into that way of thinking without really questioning it. And you have shown us how communities on the ground actually challenge it. And because of that, sometimes they find that it's very difficult for them to advance their own agendas, and how they have been criticized by technocratic actors by saying that they are not pragmatic enough, they really are not interested in the basic needs of the communities, and that they are too naive about this. And you are actually saying that we need to challenge the epistemologies that we have created of time. And I think that's really important, because in this room we have people who have been studying or want to work in the future as practitioners in reconciliation or peace building, and we need to question those starting points. And finally, I would like to say that I think you also, and I think it's connected to all of the things that you have done through this dialogue. You have shown your integrity as a peace builder academic, I will call you. So it's not only about writing a book that actually talks about these things, but you embody it and you put it into practice. And I think those are one of the things that are very challenging now, when you think that reconciliation becomes like a profession where people go and train and become like bankers, and they just think that they can deliver these things, but the lack of integrity on what they do and how they actually embody what they claim that they need to do in the processes is disconnected from it. So thank you so much, because I think this has been an inspiration for that. And I'm pretty sure that everyone in this space would like to thank you for that and to give you a round of applause. And I hope that all the rest and you join us in the next critical dialogue on reconciliation. So thank you, Angie.
Absolutely. What a generative space for me too. Thank you all for such thoughtful questions and reflections from your own work and studies and knowledge bases. I deeply appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.